We are jumping into drugs that treat infections, really all kinds of infections. We're starting with the bacteria first. This is chapter 5. I'll go through here hopefully pretty quick as we go through. Let me click on here so I can start moving my slides through so you can see poor SpongeBob, who's going to be thrown away. That's what happens to sponges, right? So terminology-wise, some basic terminology that you'll need to acquire, be able to not only define, because I may ask you some of these, especially like bactericidal, bacteriostatic, but some of these other ones I will use just in conversation or in written questions or something like that. So you'll have to have an idea of what an antibody is, what antigen, and those kind of things as well. All right, so let's jump in as we go. This is not in your text, but I did want to just go back and put this back up. You may have covered this before. If not, if it's new, it's not a whole, super difficult thing. It's just basically bacteria, right? And the way that bacteria are classified is by their shape and arrangement. So, basically, if they're in clusters right here, or if they're in chains or pairs, we have these. You guys have heard of a strep infection or a staph infection. All that does is describe the arrangement of those little bacterial cells, and then the shape of those cells. So these are both little spherical circle cells. Well, we're going to put those as cocci. So that would be the staphylococcus. This is a staphylococcus because it's round and they come in these clusters. So just to give you an idea, I do want you to know this, even though it's not in chapter 5 in your text. Really, that's the only thing that I break from the text to get to. As you start getting into the text, it does start to give you some terminology. It does talk about how bacteria are classified. And so if you look at page 86 at the top, there's a little gray box that talks about the gram stain process. This is a very, not common, but it's a very functional, important way of classifying specific bacteria. You take these little staining procedures, and if it comes up in a blue, kind of this purplish blue, it's a gram stain positive, and then we have a gram stain negative, and that just kind of identifies the type of bacteria, because that would then dictate the type of antibacterial drug that is going to be appropriate for you. And so this is not just effective at classifying the bacteria, but definitely also the antibacterial agent or the drug that we have. All right. The other big term that it starts off with is the bactericidal versus bacteriostatic. This is just in the mechanism of action. And so ultimately some drugs will actually kill the bacteria, and then other drugs will just limit their ability to multiply. That's bacteriostatic. And in that, kind of constrain them from multiplying and taking over more tissue and expanding and infection getting worse. So your own immune system then can basically get an advantage on it and start to destroy it as well. So you will need to know some of the drugs. I will tell you that I will say, yes, this is bactericidal. Sometimes you'll see things that it interferes with DNA production, causing death. Well, that's bactericidal. Or if it limits enzyme activity, limiting growth, well, that's bacteriostatic. So know these two terms going forward. The book also talks about antibiotics versus antimicrobial. These are terms you guys have heard before. There's a lot of these terms are used kind of sometimes interchangeably, and I'm not going to be. This is not going to be one that I will try to have you guys differentiate, right? I'm not going to ask you what's the difference between an antibiotic and an antimicrobial. You should know that. You should have an idea what that is. Antimicrobial is pretty much all microorganisms right down here, and then antibiotics are initially these are antibacterial agents, but more and more they're used for any kind of microorganisms out there. And I'm not going to be hardcore on, hey, the antibiotics come from an actual microorganism as opposed to synthetic. All right. So then, as we get into the drugs that actually do this, and so when we get back to the gram staining and looking at different types of antibacterial drugs and how, which drugs are effective, and specific drugs, are they effective for a lot of different infections or a lot of different bacteria, or is it just a couple of them? You can see this narrow versus broad spectrum that your book talks about. And that's based on the gram stain, is it gram-negative bacteria, is it gram-negative, gram-positive bacteria. And so ultimately, the more bacteria that one specific drug will be effective against, it becomes of a more broader spectrum. And so that's kind of the broad, that's the spectrum. It's really basic, so don't make it harder than it has to be on that. The resistance that your book talks about on page 86 as well. I'm going to give you some reading material, some literature to read. I want you guys to go in there and really read through the antimicrobial resistance. It starts on page 86, continues on to page 88. But ultimately, you already have an idea that bacteria do have the ability to mutate and can become stronger, and that's where we get some of these super infections you guys have heard of, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, so MRSA. So there's other super infections that become resistant to some pretty more mild antibiotic drugs, that kind of stuff. The why is what I want you guys to know, and so look in your book. I'm going to have some literature to read. We will definitely talk about some of the reasons of how we got to this point of having antibacterial resistance of those drugs. All right, then the book just jumps in to the different types of drugs, and the first one we have to talk about is your classic, the original penicillin. This is where the discovery was by accident, right? We left some food out, we got some mold growing, then all of a sudden that mold was killing some bacterial samples and that kind of stuff, and we said, that's kind of interesting. So yeah, that's how it was created. There was a number of different generations. So the original penicillin, and there's a number of generations that go through there, and ultimately all penicillins have in common this beta-lactam ring. That's what allows it to pretty much attach to the bacteria and start killing it and start kind of invading its cell wall and causing it to burst. And so these are bactericidal. I put this term lactamases in parentheses. That's in your text as well. You can read about that. That's one of the common, or the first mutations that bacteria underwent, is they created these enzymes that will break down this beta-lactam ring in the antibiotic medicine, and so then it can attach to the bacteria, and the bacteria just laughs and laughs as it runs on by. So you can read that. That's on page 91. Talks about just some general stuff about the penicillins, and there's a number of different generations. It says more than a dozen different types, that kind of stuff. You can look at some of those. If I can click this forward, there we go. There's my mold. I forgot I had a picture of mold. The table and the box are in there. I think these little boxes on your text are really good. The little fast facts, bulleted lists. I like bullet points, and so these are pretty good little places. Mostly the penicillins are pretty well tolerated unless there is a specific allergy to it. So some people that are actually allergic to it and it causes it, then we got to stay away from it. So most of the time it's just a little bit of maybe some diarrhea or nausea. But if you're allergic to it, then yeah, it'll get bad in a hurry. As we go through, I'm going to kind of breeze through some of these now because this information is in your book and you have the bullet points right here. But cephalosporins, you have the table 5-3 and the box 5-2 to give you some general stuff and the facts about them. I'm going to highlight just a couple things over here. Same, pretty much very similar to penicillin, broad spectrum. But if where did I put that on here? Use it over. I did put this one right here. I'm gonna highlight this one right there. Ooh, don't click it because it'll go. Dang it. I wanted to highlight this mainly because there is a crossover. If somebody is allergic to penicillin, then there's a higher likelihood they'll be allergic to cephalosporin, and it goes the other way. So if you're allergic to cephalosporins, then you might not. Then you might also be allergic to penicillin. So some care needs to be taken with those individuals as we go through. Tetracyclines are interesting. This is our first bacterial static. The drug that just kind of maintains it and prevents it from spreading, replicating, and growing. So our body can kind of get a handle on it. There is some unique things about tetracycline. Mostly the area that food, if we eat it with food, it can inhibit the absorption of it. So we try to eat it either well before or well after. So that's kind of an interesting one here. A lot of times we take medicines with drugs, but not in this case. And then the other one from an adverse effects, there's your classic nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. So photosensitivity. So people who take this and are consistently on this need to be aware when they're out in the sun that they may be more sensitive to UV radiation and sunburn quicker than they're used to. So that's kind of an interesting one. Macrolides, another one. This is again, we are static until we get to, I put cidal right here. I think your book actually talks about this too, that if it gets in a high enough concentration or high enough, amount, then it becomes cidal or will kill it. But ultimately you can see this is a good penicillin substitute that can be used in a number of different things. And then these are the last two that I'm going to pull out. There's a couple other ones in your text, but the sulfonamides and fluoroquinolones, you can kind of see some of those. Here's another one that has some photosensitivity on there as well. I want you to I want you to have an idea that these are antibiotic agents, that these are used when you hear, oh, it's a fluoroquinolone. Oh, that's an antibiotic. You may not have to know everything about it. You may have to need to know that it's clinically, you don't need to know it's bactericidal or bacteriostatic. You just know it's a drug that treats bacterial infections. Now for our test, yes, I'll ask you about which one of these are bacteriostatic or bactericidal. But in the real world, on a daily basis, somebody comes in and they're prescribed something. I don't think you're prescribed a Cipro or something like that, Cipromax. I don't think you need to be too focused on what that kind of stuff is. All right, so I got a quick ugly picture here that I'm going to show you. If you don't like this, go ahead and stop the video now. But this is a bad infection.